spine liberating trailer.
Indeed. If I can get it. If I can get it. Oh, my dear. Okay, here we go. So good morning, Timothy.
Good morning, Maya. We almost got a double take of Richard Berger's fantastic trailer.
Almost we did, yes. So how are you today?
I'm good. It's hot in Tokyo, isn't it?
It is indeed, yes. And I can see you have some nice suntan.
Yes, because I was in Shimoda last week. I reported from the backyard of the house that I was in on the beach of Shimoda last week. So this week I am back in my home office, and it's what you get.
Yes, indeed. And what we get is great. So I'm very much looking forward to today's briefing. Cannot wait for you to start it. So thank you for preparing for it today. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. Yes, and to everybody on Clubhouse, good morning and thank you for being here. Today again, we are going to hear Timothy Langley's briefing on what happened in Japanese politics during the past week. You know that Timothy Langley is the CEO of Langley Esquire, and he has been in Japan for an accumulative 40 years. He has been working in Japanese politics for almost all of that time. So let's hear what he has to say.
Thank you very much, Maya, and welcome everybody that's in the LinkedIn audience and those of you that are on Clubhouse. And I know other people will be picking up on this when Maya uploads to YouTube. But the whole purpose of this briefing is to give you a snapshot of what's going on in Japanese politics now that's meaningful for you. And then we roll over, we stop the LinkedIn video stream, and we go into question and answers. And really that's where the most fruitful part should be coming out. So I'd like to preserve as much time for that. So I'll brief for about 30 minutes today on what's going on that's important. And then we will finish this live stream and just continue on in Clubhouse. So if you're really interested and keen in participating, please join us on Clubhouse. So we just finished a very critical week for the Prime Minister, critical for him because of his stature on the world stage. You know that he was the longest serving foreign minister under the Abe administration. So his forte, his strength, you always want to lead with your strength, especially if you're a prime minister like Mr. Kishida with a new job and coming after Mr. Abe and then Mr. Suga, to really establish your presence and to make your stamp. Mr. Kishida has been a little bit faltering in that regard, but he is very dominant on the world stage. He took 5 of the 18-day campaign period to visit the G7 and NATO just this last week. So this is pretty significant. I think what we can anticipate and what we're experiencing right now is that foreign policy, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in particular, will be a strength of Japan as the United States and the Western countries begin to form this coalition as a bulwark against China and Russia. So the Prime Minister was in Germany. He had the G7 meeting 2 days there, and then he went to Madrid and joined the the NATO. He came in as NATO. NATO is very important too. Japan is not a part of NATO. There were partner countries that were invited this time: Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea. And so they went to NATO as well. This was the first time for a Japanese prime minister to be there. And so his presence was very significant as NATO created a new strategic direction for the organization. The organization was started in 1959, as you will remember, by the United States, Canada, and several European countries as a kind of coalition against potential or imagined or real Soviet Union kind of encroachment on the border states in the Balkans and that sort of thing. And it's grown since then. Mr. Kishida has said publicly, I think he's been encouraged to say that NATO needs to be a little bit more accommodating to other countries' needs and issues, and particularly in light of your microphone's still on, Maya, and particularly in light of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. The Prime Minister has slapped on yet another set of sanctions against Russia. So these are mounting, and you can anticipate that this is going to generate repercussions, as you would expect. So he's ratcheting up, and it's really unusual for Japan to be so quick and so dramatic about their reactions to any foreign country, but particularly to Russia. Mr. Shinzo Abe, the former prime minister, just before Mr. Suga, was developing relationships with Russia, at breakneck speed. He had 26 meetings with Mr. Putin one-on-one during his term as prime minister. That has kind of gone out the window, and Russia is now on the bad side of the spectrum as far as Mr. Kishida is concerned, which is a little bit strange because he's seen as something, or he was seen as something of a liberal, as dovish. And once he took over as prime minister, I think we saw a shift there, and we're going to continue to see that shift. The United States is hell-bent on containing Russia first, and then China second, and it's formed this coalition. The coalition with the Quad and with several other countries in the region. Japan doesn't belong in NATO. It's not a NATO-esque kind of country. It's the only country in Asia that is actually taking a strong stance against Russia. So it's something of an outlier. There are risks inherent there, but with Mr. Kishida's long-term as foreign minister and his best friend, his number two in his political faction, Mr. Hayashi, being his foreign minister, you can see in the Kishida administration that foreign policy will take a huge role. So that means, the G7, the OECD, NATO, they need to have some sort of a function here in Asia to anchor this presence, this military presence, to deter any kind of aggression, which is highly anticipated. And it looks like Mr. Kishida has decided that diplomatically, this is his best step forward. So taking 5 of the 18 days is a bit of a gamble. He's received a lot of criticism from people here who could have used him on a stump speech or in a particularly delicate situation for the election that's coming up. But it was a calculated risk, and we will see how those dividends pay off. He did extremely well in NATO. He did extremely well at the G7. And I think, as a consequence of that, other things are happening. So, for example, Boris Yeltsin just announced 2 days ago that food products from Fukushima are now okay to come into England. They can be sold in the shops now. Food from Fukushima, it was banned before Mr. Kishida goes to G7. Apparently there are some conversations there. Immediately it happens. Also immediately, other sanctions on Russia are announced. Gold, for example. Russia is a major producer of gold, and Japan will no longer be importing gold. And this kind of repercussion, this kind of tumbling that we constantly follow on this show, the pace has really quickened. So you might remember the Sakhalin project. There are 2 Sakhalin projects. One is for predominantly LNG gas, and the other is for oil products. Vladimir Putin has announced that that organization, Sakhalin number 2, is now being transferred to another company, and the people who have stakes in that company need to make accommodations because it's being transferred. It's actually basically a state usurpation of the company. So Shell, which has 27%, has already decided they're going to walk away from that investment. They're in negotiations with China. Would you please pick it up on pennies on the dollar? They want to get something out of it. China will come, most likely swoop in to take over that portion of the Sahalin project. You've got Mitsubishi and Mitsui. Mitsubishi is at 12%. Mitsui is at 10%, and they're debating, what are we going to do? Do we chuck this? Do we reduce the amount of LNG gas that we get, which is about 10% of Japan's national consumption during this really tense time of energy needs? So they're between a rock and a hard place. Since he's come back from Europe, though, the reaction from Russia has been very swift, and it looks like that is not even an option. So the United States and Australia, they're all scrambling to supplement that kind of diminution in LNG gas, but there's oil as well. So there's a lot going on there. And what we're seeing here, we've been doing the show, Maya, for almost a year and a half. And what I think I've noticed, and I think the audience has noticed too, is that the pace of change is quickening. Things are happening so much more briskly these days. And we are in a term of tremendous, really tectonic change going on right now. Maybe it takes a year or so for us to look back and acknowledge it and realize it, because we're in the thick of it now. But there is so much going on that's really important and really grabs our attention. Let's shift over to the elections that are coming up this time next week. So elections will go for the rest of this week. They will stop at sunset on Saturday night. And then Sunday, all of the polling booths will open up, and we will know probably around maybe noon or sometime in the afternoon how much of an advantage the LDP has secured. We know that they're going to do extremely well. The number of seats, there are 250 seats in the upper house. Half of those are up for election now, so about 125. And people, when they've polled, have said, this is how I intend to vote. We're in the campaign period, so how reliable is that? It's actually pretty reliable. So 28% have said, of those polled have said that they will vote for the LDP. This is the highest in 15 years of pre-election polling that says that the people say that they will vote for the LDP. This is tremendous. And the LDP has 56 seats now of the 125 that are up. It has a coalition partner with Komeito, so it has more than that. But if it wins 56 seats this election, that will be status quo. It will be standing at the same position that it is standing before that election started. And I think most people would evaluate that as a failure of the Kishida administration. I think what they need is more than that. They need to establish something of a majority. It would be great if they could establish a majority in the upper house without the reliance on Komeito. That would give the LDP a real ability to control. Already they control all of the committee appointments. So all of the committees, the important committees inside the parliament and the upper house, in the lower house, are controlled by the LDP. But there's more going on here. And what I'm talking about is the revision of the Constitution, which is heavy on the minds of the politicians. So 70 seats, if they win 70 seats in this election, that gives them a majority in the upper house. They can stay with Komeito. They don't need Komeito. They'll probably stick with Komeito, obviously. But if they have a super majority, 82 seats of the 125 seats that are up for grabs right now, that would give them a super majority. That would give them 2/3. And you can bet your bottom dollar that should that happen, it's unlikely to happen, that the bill to revise the Constitution will immediately be launched. The Secretary General of the LDP has already announced, maybe 2 weeks ago, that top on his agenda is revising the Constitution after the elections. So I anticipate it will happen sometime before the end of the year. Other people say it will probably take a little bit longer. I'm pessimistic about that. I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later. And the critical feature here is not just the election, because I think the LDP will do extremely well in this election. They have the coalition partner Komeito, and they also have other parties who want to vote with them and get a little bit more skinship with the LDP by accommodating them on the revision of the Constitution in exchange for something else that they might get. So in fact, not being in the opposition, but being somewhat aligned to the leadership, the administration of the government, would enhance their survivability and their likelihood of getting even more votes in the upcoming election, which would be the next lower house election in about 3 years. So a lot is going on there. The prime minister came back from 5 days. Where did he go? He went immediately to Okinawa. This is really a salient point that, you know, we like to focus on. I like to focus on Okinawa. I think Okinawa is a critical component of the entire mix. But he went to Okinawa to campaign for two candidates. One is a candidate for the LDP, and the other is a kind of an independent, that a new person into the political process, that Mr. Kishida is hoping he will woo, if the fellow wins, into the Kishida faction. Obviously, into the LDP, he is leaning towards the LDP. But in Okinawa, you're a little bit hesitant to stake a claim because of the animosity that exists between Tokyo and Okinawa. You know that the governor goes up for election in August. Danny Tamaki is the governor. He is an interesting guy. He was in the parliament, and then he left there to run for governor. He won governorship. This is his second term as governor. He is in a battle with the central government because he doesn't toe the line, and he is very adamantly opposed to the transition of the Marine base at Futenma to Henoko. And there's a lot going on there. There's also a hunger strike. You probably didn't hear about it, like you just didn't hear about the UFO report. But there's a hunger strike after the Battle of Okinawa ended last week. We reported just briefly on that, how horrendous that battle was. It was the largest battle in the Pacific theater. Lasted 90 days. A quarter of the population was annihilated. The entire country was, or the entire island was conscripted. And there's an organization of the bereaved, of the people who died in Okinawa, and the leader of that group is on a hunger strike for a couple of reasons, but not only in anticipation of Prime Minister Kishida visiting the peace monument and making his condolences and making a speech there, also campaigning as a result. But the argument for the Association of the Bereaved is that the land that is being scooped up and dumped into the shallows in Henoko is coming from this part of the island where the last battle was fought. And his argument is that the blood and the souls and the essence of these people who died to preserve Japan, they were the ones who were really the victims of the battle, are being dumped in the ocean to support, another war machine, to support the United States from having even a larger piece of Okinawa. So Okinawa will be very critical. We're focused now on the election in 10 days, but next up is Okinawa. It will be highly fought. Governor Tamaki, as we were talking about just earlier, he's interesting because we don't know who his father is. He doesn't know who his father is. His father was an American soldier, born out of wedlock, and searches have been made to try and find who his father was. People have never found out. I think he's probably given that up. But he represents, a huge portion of the Okinawan population. And so as Okinawa goes, I think the defense alliance with the United States also goes. So there will be a lot of money that will be devoted there. There will be a heavy campaigning. There'll be heavy campaigning now for the upper house election, and then guaranteed in August, we keep our eyes there. Obon is a huge issue in Okinawa, as you can imagine. They do Obon a little bit differently here. They actually visit the grave sites. They have a family picnic. I've been involved in several of those. It's a really different kind of obon, but obon will be hot this year in Okinawa. Let's see what else I've got for the LDP. I think that's about it. It's amazing to point out that although the stance of the prime minister is to punish Russia for the aggressions in Ukraine, and he's getting lots of mileage in the G7 as a component of that, and also NATO. NATO, he's committed to providing 2% of GDP for defense spending. That is a requirement for NATO countries, even though there is no submission of Japan to join NATO. But it is significant. It's important to realize, though, although McDonald's left Japan and the Russians, of course, took over it, they renamed it, they kept all the machinery, and they're pumping out hamburgers now. Less than 3% of Japanese firms in Russia have withdrawn. That's the lowest of all of the OECD countries. So it's perplexing, but I think the economics kind of dictate that. And the prime minister has a certain amount of enormous power, but with Keidanren and the business organizations, he's somewhat reluctant to go full bore. And finally, before I close up and move on to the Bank of Japan, the price of goods and services in Japan is really rising. It is one of the campaign issues, and it seems that one of the concepts of the Kishida administration, new capitalism, is to somehow lift up the working class, particularly the underclass, those are receiving minimum wages, and up to the middle class. So this group here seems to be taking the brunt of price inflation and the diminution of services and just things being more expensive. His new capitalism requires them to receive more pay so that they can accommodate that. The Bank of Japan is pushing for 2% inflation. He's been, Mr. Kudoda, the president of the Bank of Japan, has been pushing for that for the last 8 years. He has a 10-year term, 9 years, I guess, he's been in office. And his term comes up this time next year. So Keidanren and the Association of Companies has basically said in a meeting this last week, we would really like to raise the wages of our employees, but we just can't. So let's kick that ball down the path. Why don't you, government, just provide a couple more subsidies and help us overcome this bump that we're in? And this strategy, this kind of supplementing by paying subsidies or having artificial caps on price controls, it addresses not the cause, but it addresses just the outcome of the cause. So it's kind of like eating Chinese food. You're hungry again in 15 minutes later. So there's a fight going on there. We had expected perhaps last week or 2 weeks ago in this briefing that perhaps the government would come up with some sort of a tax policy, a new tax policy that punishes companies for not relinquishing more of their benefits, more of their profits, because they've been hoarding it for the last 15 years. Records indicate that. Hoarding it for a rainy day. Their argument now is that we're in the rainy day and we're using it to keep prices pretty low so that consumers can still buy our products, but we can't distribute more of that to the employees. So that fight is being had right now, and it looks like the employees are losing. So the government is more compelled to offer subsidies for payments of childcare to enhance those kinds of services. Also gasoline prices, LNG. We're in a tight situation here with the amount of energy that's available and the amount of energy that's being consumed in these hot months. So the number of people who have died from heat stroke is spiking. People are flooding to the beaches. There are, as there always are here, a record number of drownings, which are always sad. But Mr. Kishida has said, I'm going to re-trigger those mothballed nuclear power plants because we need more energy. LNG is kind of out the window. We understand that's coming, although he has said it's not coming right now. I think that's a little bit tongue in cheek. I think Mr. Putin is going to act very swiftly, and Japan is going to be out of LNG sooner rather than later. So look forward to some more news coming out on the new reactors or the old reactors being rejiggered and coming online. It will be a hot summer, and the winter is not going to look much better than that. Moving on, and I'd like to go swiftly. I apologize for spending so much time on Mr. Kishida. I'd like to preserve as much time for the Q&A, so I'll be as brief as possible. Haruhiko Kudoda is the president of the Bank of Japan. He has one more year left in his tenure. He is appointed by the prime minister, although they like to not brag, but they like to promote their independence from politics. Mr. Kudoda got into a little bit of trouble this last week. I reported on it last week on a comment that he made in encouraging businesses to go ahead and keep the prices, inflation high, 2%. We need to continue to push inflation because although it hurts a little bit, it appears to me, the president of the Bank of Japan, that consumers are okay with prices increasing a little bit more. He said that publicly in conjunction with another part of his speech, which wasn't reported, but he got lambasted for saying that consumers are okay with the rising prices, and everybody says, what the hell are you talking about? What planet do you live on? So he got a lot of heat this last week. He was lambasted. The number of hits for Kudoda doubled, far beyond what his hits were when he was appointed as Bank of Japan, Kudoda. Haruhiko Kudoda, the name went into the search engines in 2013, and the number of hits for Kudoda this last week has doubled that. So people are really mad, and it comes at a bad time with the LDP promoting not only the 2% inflation, but also the price rise of goods and services. So 60% of this inflation is attributed to energy costs, and 40% is attributed to foodstuffs, food costs. And practically every producer in Japan for foodstuffs has announced a price hike. So everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. And by this time, not next year, but certainly by October, November, prices will have all undergone a tremendous change. So this fight between the labor and business is really beginning to boil up. It's been quiet because of the elections. You can expect that to explode towards the end of this month and moving into August. So it will be very hot. Let's see what else. He was criticized. He bought a condominium with cash. So that really angered a lot of people. His salary is about $250,000 a year, which is not extravagant for a bureaucrat. It's kind of in line with senior officials. So he's really under the gun there. So the people who are kind of edging their way over for consider me for his replacement, that race is beginning to hit the surface and the tabloids as well. Let's see what else we've got here. One of the issues that he has as president of the Bank of Japan is that this announcement about, I think the consumers can take this hit to their pocketbooks was made in conjunction with, but you need to relinquish more of your surplus profits to the employees. That part was taken out. And in fact, having that kind of stumble by the PR department, by his PR department, although it was a policy speech, he had smart people working on it. The issue of having people in the PR department rotated every 3 years, it happens in all companies. It happens in all companies because that's how the government does it. So the government kind of sets the standard. Companies, the big companies kind of follow that pattern, thinking that the government knows best how to run things. So they follow that pattern. And this idea of rotating people so that you have generalists throughout your organization has been criticized. What people say he needs in a PR department are professionals who know what the hell they're talking about, and they're not 60 years old and don't know anything about social media. Social media is critical, not only in managing public perceptions and expectations, but also in polling and in in elections. So a lot of changes going on here. He's gotten bitten by that, so you can expect more change coming. And it also opens up not just Mr. Kudoda and the Bank of Japan, but also Mr. Kishida and his administration to tremendous opposition attack. You don't care about the people. You're only caring about big business. You only care about profits and that sort of thing. And there's a little bit to be said for that. Japan has been in the doldrums for about 15 years, 20 years since the Lehman shock, has not really been able to come out of that. So there is something to be said about that. But still, this being Japan, the opposition is still going to get pretty much crushed. The CDP, the Constitutional Democratic Party, is likely to do better than it did last time, but not by much. Ishin is expected to do tremendously well, so keep your eye on that. Let's see. Oh yes, on the comment by Mr. Kudoda, they did a poll. Of course, we always do polls to find out what everybody else is thinking, because if we don't know what everybody else is thinking, we don't know what to think, and we don't know what decisions to make. So polls are very popular here. Of those polled, and it was a significant poll, 77% of those polled said the comments of the president of the Bank of Japan were inappropriate. 58% said that he is unfit to hold his office, and 70% said what he said is going to weigh in my consideration during election balloting and which lever I pull for the candidates. So it is a very heavy hit. I want to move on now. I've got just two other reports to make. I don't know if you caught this one. Probably not by design, but there was a report from Fukuoka Research Institute about a UFO sighting with photographs. It was announced on June 24th, so it was about the time that we had this this briefing last week, and they provided the photographs to the ministry, and the chief cabinet secretary responded. I'm sorry, the deputy chief cabinet secretary. They didn't even give it to the chief cabinet. It doesn't reach that level of importance. He responded to it 2 days later, and he said, it is announced that there was announced a sighting of a UFO, and I'm here to announce that it was nothing, no big deal. We just, I wanted to let people know to calm down. There's nothing there. There's no smoke there. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. I'm not trying to promote the existence of UFOs or aliens, except for Maya in this room, but you might remember Kono Taro was a Minister of Defense, and he gave an order to the Ministry of Defense, and he said, look, UFOs and UFO sightings, it's really reaching a level globally, and I want you to capture and analyze data that might be coming in that suggests some kind of activity that's, I mean, he was Minister of Defense, so he has a little bit more information than the normal Joe does, and he probably heard a lot more about the Tic Tac UFO that was reported in the United States and also reported in the US Congress just this year. But that news was out there 2-3 years ago. So when Mr. Kono was defense minister, he instructed the SDF, the Self-Defense Forces pilots, to report on this. And in this announcement by the Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary, he said, oh, by the way, since that announcement by Mr. Kono, there has been no reports. So it looks like there's nothing to see here. Let's move on. My next point of interest is, and then he moved on very quickly. I mentioned that because it's so funny that they would do that. And, the Research Institute is not just, a bunch of guys in their underwear in their mom's basement. This is a legitimate research organization that came up with this and announced it and reported it as was their duty. And to be kind of pushed down, it's kind of curious. But I think those of us who have lived in Japan for a while kind of nod knowingly. Let me see. The only other thing I want to talk about, well, there are a couple of just interesting things. Fernan Marcos, his grandson became president of the Philippines this last week. He just took office. His election was 2 weeks ago. He took office this last week. He is 64 years old. His name is also Ferdinand, but people call him Bong Bong. He got 60% of the vote. So a lot is going on in the Philippines. The Philippines is a little bit of a, I don't know, a risky place for all of this energy that's going into Mr. Kishida and South Korea and Australia, because since the United States pretty much abandoned the Philippines, Subic Bay, and withdrew from the military presence there, the Philippines has received lots of funding, lots of love and attention from China and from Russia. And it looks like the president, the current president now, he's still in a fight with the United States. He's sued in Hawaii. He can't travel to the United States because he'll be arrested. He's under court order for the theft of billions of dollars from him and his grandmother, Imelda Marcos. You might remember that. So they've kind of ignored that, but I think the Philippines is going to be a bit of a thorn in the side of this alliance and coalition and the Quad and all of this energy that's going into this region. You can see that a lot of things are building up, and it's not always good news, but we are in a kind of a critical point, a critical phase here. And I expect that it's going to get hotter before it gets cooler. I've predicted that North Korea will have a underground nuclear test very soon, probably in recognition of maybe even the elections this next week. So stay tuned for that. Hong Kong, 12 years under Chinese rule. They're now moving in much more briskly and aggressively. President Xi actually went to Hong Kong for the turnover and for the naming of the new chief executive of the city, John Lee. So he will be an aggressive administrator. This is big news for China. It's big news for expatriates who are working in financial institutions and the kind of expatriate community there. They are fleeing, looking to go to Singapore. And you might not have noticed it unless you're in the industry, but there are a lot of Hong Kongese coming into Japan, looking for buildings to buy, businesses to buy, because they know that the clock is ticking on their ability to maintain their previous lifestyle in Hong Kong. So there's a lot going on there, and a lot to be anticipated very shortly. I think that's about it for the top line. I hope this has been beneficial to you, and I have other things that I'd like to talk about, but I think I'd just like to open it up to Q&A and find out what everybody else is talking about. So, beep, 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 beep. Maya, how's it going?
It's going very well, thank you. Yes, you got me laughing, out loud. With that comment, yes. Well, we have to accept the fact that there are aliens among us. Of course, me being one of them, so that's it. Okay, so thank you, Timothy. And well, this was a great briefing again. I'm looking forward to your moving over to Clubhouse. So I will see you over there. We are going to stop the streaming now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody that's in the audience. Please join us at Clubhouse if you have the time and inclination. And next week, see you on Sunday.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, Timothy.